Replacement of the rear shock spring and the fork springs on a TTR125 LE. Here's the new rear shock spring. It's an adult rate spring, front fork shocks, springs, and TTR125 is pretty much set up for somebody 120 pounds or less. These will allow it to carry somebody up to around 160 or so. First, we remove the rear wheel, then we're going to remove the rear shock. First thing we do is remove the bottom bolt. I'd have to use a screwdriver or something to push the bolt out. It's a 14 millimeter. Popped the bottom of the shock off the mount just with a screwdriver, just pops right off. And then we got to remove the top bolt to the shock, and that is a 17 millimeter. Now this bike has the compression rebound setting, or cylinder up at the front that you have to remove to take the whole shock out. Do not remove the lines from it, they're pressurized, but we're going to remove that clamp here, and then we're going to feed it right back through here. This is the hose, and you probably have to remove the fuel line to get it past there, and then right through here, and then we feed the shock out the bottom. All right, now we've got the compression rebound, or even a compression dampener cylinder out, and we had to pull the fuel line off here to get it through there. There was a zip tie on here up above. Now we're gonna just pull this down a little bit and drop the shock back off the rear. It pops right out there, and we're gonna feed it down through here, and then this is gonna be fed right through there, but I need both hands. So out, and the cylinder is out. Now we need to compress the spring. I don't have a spring compressor, so I did this last week on another TTR. I'm just gonna clamp the springs on both sides, just something like that. And we'll continue the next step. All right, been working on bikes all day. Third one. Now it's time for a little reward. All right, so we've got the vice grips on there. It's not the greatest plan, but I've done it before. Yeah, you're gonna scratch up the spring, and if they pop off, you gotta watch your fingers, because your finger's gonna get pinched or something's gonna go flying. So don't really recommend this. It'd be best to use a spring compressor, or just have a shop do it. They can do it really quick. But the idea is to loosen up the tension up here on the spanner so that we can get that removed. Sometimes these are a pain. You need to go get a spanner wrench if you can. I've done it without it, but keeping the top solid and getting that first lock off is the key. So got a screwdriver here, doing this all by myself to hold the shock. And I'm going to use the spanner wrench to turn this, but once again I need both hands. So all right, so I've got the top spanner nut loose, and thanks to my spanner wrench and a hammer and a screwdriver and my foot, you can do it single-handedly. Before you take the spring off, measure the spring length, and this one's about 6 1/4. Oh, yeah, about 6 1/4. That way you know what your spring length should be when it's mounted. You can adjust your preload and hence the sag, but since we're doing a different spring, a heavier one, that calculation could be different, but at least you have a reference. All right, finally something I can do with one hand here, using the spanner wrench to loosen up that last nut. And once we get both of them off of there, we'll be able to pull out this base to the shock spring down here. All right, before I release the vice grips, we need to pull this bottom spring retention plate here out. And there's a slot that you can see there. It's going to pop up above off that bottom piece and then slide out from underneath the spring, and the spring will come off the bottom here. Okay, so you can see I've got that plate off. Don't forget where that goes. I just use a screwdriver right up in this slot, push the spring up, and it pops right out. All right, so got the new spring and the old spring side by side. You can see the new one's a little bit thicker. It's hard to tell, but it is. And it's wound a little bit tighter, so it's going to carry more weight. And they're about the same length. So I'd probably go ahead and stick with the 6.25 length as far as when you tighten the spanner nuts down. Probably stick with that. You can always adjust it later. A little tricky. It's not easy to get that back underneath the spring unless you have a spring compressor. So I dialed this all the way up to the top as far as I could. Now I'm just going to use a screwdriver, and I'm just going to kind of pry and feed that in there and tap it with a hammer lightly to coax it back in there. So again, I'm solo, so I don't have two hands to hold the phone and everything and record, but I'll show you the final product, and this is kind of how you just have to do it. So since this is so difficult, I'm going to kind of show you, try and hold the phone and the screwdriver with one hand, and we're just going to tap on the plate here that has to go on top of that underneath the spring. And this is how I'm doing. I'm just driving it in there, just like this, really harder. That wasn't so bad. Like I said, I just held the screwdriver in the slot, tapped the hammer on the plate, and it popped right in. All right, so I've got the top spanner, the lower spanner nut tightened down to where the spring's at about 6 1/4, roughly where it was when we started. I just did this by hand. I held the shock with the top. As long as your vice grips are tight, it should work out okay. Otherwise, you can always use a vise, and the spanner wrench just tighten things down that way. So I've got the top locking spanner nut done, and everything's all tightened up. I can release my stake, release the vice grips, and we're done. You are gonna, scratch up the coil just a little bit, but it's an older bike. It's 2007, so I'm not real concerned. The rest of it's kind of scratched up a little bit too. All the same way it came out. I'm just gonna shove the shock right up through here. It's kind of hard with one hand, but two hands, you can see it'll be a lot easier. Almost done. So we've got the shock threaded all the way up there. We got the line up underneath here for the cylinder there. We're gonna reattach that with the clamp, and bolt everything down, and we're done. The front forks are a lot easier. All right, got the rear wheel back on, tightened up, a little bit of play in the chain. Top bolts in, bottom bolts in. Got the hose ran through up to the cylinder, it's remounted. And that's the end of the rear shock spring installation. Now we're going to do the front fork.